Hey everybody! Welcome to CAF Warbird Tube, the show where we talk about World War II, aviation, history, and so much more. Warbird Tube is produced by the Commemorative Air Force, the world's largest flying museum. Our mission is to educate, inspire, and honor through flight and living history experiences. The CAF began the Warbird movement more than 65 years ago, and thanks to the support of individuals like you, we continue to grow strong. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and now our host, Steve Buss. Thanks for watching and keep 'em flying.
Well, good evening, airplane enthusiasts, and welcome to another edition of CAF Warbird Tube. Tonight, episode number 201, we look back 80 years to the pivotal battle for Okinawa with Chris Kolakowski. Now, whether you're joining us for the very first time or you're a loyal Warbird Tube fan, we are very happy to have you with us tonight. If you enjoy our content, don't forget to spread it across your favorite social media platforms. We do appreciate it. Warbird Tube is made possible by the Commemorative Air Force. To find out more about the CAF, our events, aircraft, tours are now just about ready to start up for the spring and summer. Visit our website. You can be a part of the action too, commemorativeairforce.org. Now, as you're watching tonight, if you have any questions, just type those in the chat box and we'll try to answer them either during the program or we'll save time at the end before we sign off to answer any questions you may have. And joining us from the Wisconsin Veterans Museum, Chris, always a pleasure to have you on the show. Chris Kolakowski, who is the director of the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. Tonight, we go back to Okinawa, 1945.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's always great to work with you all, and always great to support the wonderful work that you all do to keep them flying and to keep these planes and the people that flew them originally, keep their memories alive too. Exactly. What we're going to do tonight is the time that we have, we're going to look at the largest sea-air-land battle in the history of the world, and that's the Battle of Okinawa, which started 80 years ago yesterday, April 1st, 1945. And lasted until formal resistance ended basically July 1st, July 2nd. So 90 days in and around Okinawa. So if you could, Steve, let's go if you get nothing else out of this presentation, first bullet point I've already explained to you. Bloodiest Battle of the Pacific War, largest sea-air-land battle in history. And both sides considered it a full dress rehearsal for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. You know, we look back now, Okinawa was the last battle, which is actually the title of the volume in the Army official history about Okinawa. But to nobody that fought the battle, it was going to be the last fight. Everybody knew this was a full dress rehearsal for the invasion of Japan. So as we go through our story, keep those 2 points in mind, and you'll get a feel, it'll help put things in perspective. So where are we? Let's start with where is Okinawa? And I know some people in the audience probably have been stationed there, courtesy of Uncle Sam, or have traveled there or flown over, whatever. But let's start with where we are. Here's Asia. You can see up in the northeast corner there is North America, the United States, Canada, Alaska. In the northwest corner, north being at the top, by the way, the Soviet Union. And then as you come down south into China, Outer Mongolia, and then China, and then India, Southeast Asia, and down into Indonesia, Australia, in the southern part of the map. And then a whole bunch of islands in the central part of the Pacific. And then if you notice the blue glob, basically between the green splotch that is Indochina and those islands in the center, that's the Philippines. If you go north for the Philippines 500 miles, that's Taiwan or Formosa. And then if you go northeast 500 miles, between Japan, the Japanese home islands, and Formosa, basically right in the middle, that's Okinawa and the Ryukyus. So that's where we are. We're practically on the doorstep of Japan. And as a matter of fact, this actually gives you a pretty good feel for where we are in the Pacific War by February of 1945. Japan had basically, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and we talked about that in another Warbird Tube before, had conquered most of the area on the map. And then in a series of drives back across, first of all, coming out of Hawaii under Chester Nimitz and going west across the Pacific, and then from Australia up via New Guinea to the Philippines under Douglas MacArthur, we're approaching the Japanese home islands. The first idea was to cut the Japanese home islands off from Indonesia and French Indochina, which is where the resources that power the Japanese war machine are. And then having done that, prepare for the invasion of the home islands itself. And as part of that, while MacArthur is liberating the Philippines, Nimitz's forces turn their attention to two targets, outposts, to set up the invasion of the Japanese home islands. The first one is Iwo Jima on the Volcano Islands, the Bonin Islands, which is right, actually, if you see the 109th Division that's marked there, that's Iwo Jima, right in the, basically in the center of the map where you've got the cursor. And then to the west of it is where the Japanese 32nd Army is, and that's Okinawa. And so those will be the objectives, again, to set up for the invasion of Japan. So let's look at Okinawa itself. What is Okinawa? Okinawa is the largest island in the Ryukyu chain, which stretch basically from the southern islands of Japan, Kyushu, all the way down and ends a couple hundred miles from Taiwan. As a matter of fact, U.S. bases today in Okinawa, were something to happen at Taiwan, have a front row seat. Okinawa is a prefecture of Japan. It has been ruled by Japan since 1879. It has an analogous relationship to Hawaii as Hawaii to the continental United States. It is represented in the Japanese legislature. It is a part of Japan, although most Japanese, when they think of Japan itself, they think of the home islands. They don't necessarily think of the Ryukyus. Okinawa is 62 miles long. At its widest point, it's 17 miles wide. At its narrowest point, it is 2 miles wide. The terrain is generally rolling in most areas. In fact, the northern part is very forested. Most of the 400,000 Okinawans live in the southern third of the islands, in and around the port of Naha, the ancient capital of Shuri, and that whole area down there in the southern part of the islands. The middle part of the islands, right about where you see the word O in Okinawa on the map, is flat plain, and there are several air bases there that will be, is one of the reasons that the island is targeted, is because it'll be a good spot for ultimately 8th Air Force once they deploy from Europe, and elements of 7th Air Force to support the invasion of Japan. So, but that's Okinawa, and you can see some of the other islands offshore as well that are targets. This gets you a little bit more detailed into Okinawa, and you can get a feel for how the island was developed at the time. In fact, the chief engineer of 10th Army, which is the American Army that will invade, talked about how Okinawa was gifted with an excellent network of bad roads. And you can see what I mean, and you can see the scale of development. Look at the density of the roads in the southern part of the island, and then look at how they get progressively less dense the further north you go. That's a function of sparse population, but that's also a function of terrain. So there's a lot of development that will have to be done to prepare this as a base for an eventual invasion of Japan. But nonetheless, Okinawa is considered a desirable place to commit Americans to capture. And so that is the objective. A little bit of history about Okinawa. We've already talked about some of this. It was an independent kingdom until the Japanese annexed it in 1879. Matthew Perry had visited there both on his way in and on his way out of Tokyo Bay in 1853 and 1854. Naha, capital, it's a good port, still is a good port. The air bases we've talked about. And then the other thing I want to mention is we talk about this being on the Japanese doorstep. You're only 300 miles from Kyushu, the southernmost of the Japanese home islands. So, and you're only, by the way, 500 miles from Shanghai and 500 miles from Japanese bases on Taiwan. So this is a very deep thrust into what's left of the Japanese Empire. And you are on basically on the front doorstep of the Japanese home islands. So here's the American plan of attack. And we'll talk about the forces, and I'll talk about the Japanese defenses here in a minute. But here's what the Americans decide they're going to do. Is they are going to seize, it's Operation Iceberg is what it's called. And what they're going to do is they're going to capture Okinawa and outlying islands. They're going to start with landing at the Karama Redo, which you see there on the western part of the map, to secure an anchorage for the fleet that is going to be needed to support this invasion and be in the area for a while. And then they're going to invade Okinawa April 1st, 1945. You can see land on the west coast, and we'll talk about the composition of forces shortly. And then in subsequent operations, secure islands offshore, both Ayashima there you can see to the north, and then other islands further north that'll be radar outposts and potential airfield sites as well. So aviation from the first is a very important part of the plan for Iceberg. Now, when the 10th Army comes ashore, you'll notice that if you look real carefully at the map, they're supposed to push across the island, which at that point is 6 miles wide. It's supposed to take them 2 weeks. Then when they get across the island, they're going to turn south, phase 1, secure southern Okinawa, turn north, phase 2, secure northern Okinawa, phase 3, secure the offshore islands. All of this is supposed to be done within 4 months, 120 days. It'll all be done in 90 days. But remember that basic plan. We're going to come back to it a little bit later, because Buckner, there's going to be some modifications made in the heat of battle to that plan. So here are the commanders. Here's whose job it is to execute Operation Iceberg. The guy in the center is Chester Nimitz, who's one of the greatest admirals this country has ever produced. He's been the Supreme Commander since December 31st, 1941. That's a whole Warbird episode in and of itself, is Nimitz and his leadership. But he's the overall commander of the Central Pacific Theater. The fleet commander that is going to take the American forces to Okinawa is the guy there in the pith helmet to the left. That is Admiral Raymond Spruance, who, of course, is probably well known to the audience, the victor of Midway, the victor of Philippine Sea. He has masterminded most of the campaigns in the Central Pacific. The Japanese feared him more than any other admiral that the United States had. And then the guy on the right is the ground commander. He's commanding U.S. 10th Army. That's General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., whose father was a Civil War figure of some note and governor of Kentucky. Buckner Jr. had been in command in Alaska from December of 1940, even before the war, all the way until the summer of 1944, when he was brought to Honolulu to create a field army headquarters to mount what will ultimately be the largest invasion in the Central Pacific. And we'll talk more about his forces here in a minute. But all of them highly experienced, all of them proven commanders in other areas, and have worked together. In fact, if you look at Buckner's diaries and you look at some of the writings and the preparatory before the campaign, all of them have worked very hard to make sure that there's no inter-service rivalry and that everybody's here to work with each other and to do what is necessary to secure the objective. And so the sense of teamwork is very, very high among these commanders as we go in.
And with that, I mean, obviously lessons learned earlier in the war. And as you said, this is really the dress rehearsal for potential invasion of Japan. I can't think of any more experienced or qualified leaders to be in charge of this operation.
I would absolutely agree with that. And everybody assumed it was going to be a dress rehearsal. In fact, right toward the end of the battle, Spruance is pulled away from the battle and hands over to Admiral William Halsey to finish off the campaign, because Spruance is then sent back to Honolulu to rest up and start thinking about commanding the fleet for the invasion of the home islands proper. So absolutely, that is very much on their minds. So let's talk about the opponents. General Buckner, by the way, had been Commandant of Cadets at West Point. I bring that up because it's an analogous position to his opponent on Okinawa, Ushijima Mitsuru, who is second in from the right. That's him and his staff during the battle. Ushijima, highly experienced officer, has an extremely capable staff. He had been superintendent of the Japanese Military Academy before going to take command of 32nd Army on Okinawa. So he's a capable soldier. In fact, of the Japanese Army commanders that we face, the United States faces in World War II in the Pacific, Ushijima is one of the three best. I rank him right there with General Hama and General Yamashita as the three most capable field army commanders in the Pacific. And we'll talk about his strategy here in just a second. But he's a smart guy. He's been studying previous campaigns, and that affects his strategy and his tactics and his approach to the battle. So, we talked about just a minute ago how the Americans are learning and developing a team. The Japanese are doing exactly the same thing, particularly as the battle lines get ever closer to the home islands. So let's go. Here's the ground forces. Here's the lineup for you. The United States is going to land 183,000 men on the first day. U.S. 10th Army, half of them Marines, 3rd Amphibious Corps with the 1st and 6th Marine Division, and the U.S. Army's 24th Corps and you can see the infantry divisions there with attached support units. When you add up all the Island Command forces and the other forces that will be on the ground, including 10th Army's own Tactical Air Force, they're the only field army in World War II to have its own Tactical Air Force. It's actually going to be over 250,000, edging up to 500,000 by the end of the battle, Americans on the island. The Japanese are going to have 120,000. 32nd Army, experienced divisions, 24th and 62nd, 44th Independent Brigade, some other attached units, some naval troops, and including 20,000 Okinawan militia. Boatai is what it's known as, 120,000. Until almost the end of the battle, Buckner's intelligence will assume there's only 60 to 70,000 Japanese on the island. It's only, we count bodies, and when the body count gets that high, do we realize there's actually more than we thought? And that's something that should be remembered and is often forgotten when we assess the American performance in this battle. I think that sets the line. Oh, yeah, one more thing I have to do, which is the defenses. Ushijima realized very early on that the Americans had, because they bring an air force and they bring a sizable fleet to every amphibious invasion that they mount, he realized, I can't defend on the beaches. My job is to hold and bleed the Americans as long as I can, while air attacks from Kyushu hopefully demolish the fleet offshore, and bleed the Americans long enough so that they might sue for peace and rethink this whole invasion of the Japanese home islands. So what he does is he decides to mass the bulk of his army in the southern third of Okinawa and dig in all those ridges and create a series of interlocking defenses. And this gives you an idea of what that looks like. You can see tunnels, caves connected by tunnels, different machine gun nests, all with interlocking fields of fire, and then also with, you can see the obstacles kind of in the foreground there. So they channel the American attack into certain areas that are then kill zones for Japanese weaponry. And because of camouflage, or being able to withdraw into the caves, it's very hard to get at. The Americans are going to find it very hard to get at them. If you've ever seen the movies Hacksaw Ridge, which is about Okinawa, or Letters from Iwo Jima, which is it's a similar tactic that's used on Iwo, you get a feel for kind of how that was set up and how the Japanese were expected to conduct themselves and how difficult it was for the Americans ultimately. So, but that's what Ushijima decides to do, with effects that we'll see here in the battle. So I'm going to show a lot of maps. I'm just going to warn the audience, they are Rorschach tests. The big thing I want you to absorb the general implications, okay? Here we are, the landings on the west coast, the Higuchi beaches as they're known, April 1st. And notice the dark hatched line that basically is on the other end of the island. That's the advance after 72 hours. The Americans land, they suffer almost no casualties the first day. In fact, there's a soldier of the 7th Division, walks a few hundred yards inland, turns and says to nobody in particular, I've already lived longer than I thought I would. And so very quickly, the Americans push across the island and they have achieved what they were expecting to take 2 weeks. And so Buckner decides to reverse his field. He decides to hit out. He tells the Marines, go ahead and execute phase 2. He tells the 24th Corps, go ahead and turn south, start executing phase 1. Let's find the Japanese. And let's find out what's going on. It's an aggressive move that speeds up the campaign. It really does. And it's something Buckner is kind of overlooked in his performance. While this is going on and while the Americans feeling down and feeling for the Japanese, we get the first mass kamikaze attacks starting on April 6th. They are nicknamed Kikusui, which is floating chrysanthemum, which is a beautiful name for a tremendously horrible thing. This is not the sole method of attack mounted from the Japanese home islands and from Taiwan and from China, although mostly from Kyushu, from the home islands. But it is going to be the majority. And this will be the first one. This will be the largest one on April 6th. There will be 1,000 planes, and there will be 10 major ones over the course of the battle. The last one's ending in late June. Those will be they'll always number several hundred aircraft. But as you can imagine, kamikazes are something of a diminishing asset as your experienced pilots and the you've probably, I know in other episodes you've talked about the issues and even the fuel limitations and how they can't really train these people to do much of anything. But this is the Kamikazes taking off here from Kyushu to attack the American fleet. Over the course of the battle, 36 American ships will be sunk, another 368 damaged. And we'll talk about the psychological, we'll talk more about the Kamikazes as we go. But Okinawa is a battle, like I said, sea, air, land. It's fought in all three dimensions in a very intense way, unlike anything we've seen in the Pacific War, perhaps since Guadalcanal in 1942. At the same time, the Japanese surface fleet gets into action. This is the ultimate kamikaze, where they send battleship Yamato, the most powerful battleship afloat, to go after the American fleet, along with a light cruiser and 8 destroyers. Task Force 58, 5th Fleet, under Spruance, goes after Yamato. They think about sending the American battleships to go fight Yamato, but the American carrier admirals say, we can take care of it with air power. And so they do. Over the course of about 2.5 hours, this is a whole presentation in itself. Over the course of about 2.5 hours, they sink Yamato, and that's Yamato blowing up as she goes down, makes the final plunge. Of the 3,332 men aboard, just about 300 are picked up. And it's called the ultimate kamikaze because she left Japan with only fuel enough for a one-way trip. So it says something about the Japanese and the desperation that they're feeling and how they're pushing every chip into the center of the table to defend this island and to make this as bloody for the Americans as they can. So let's look at the battle ashore a little bit here. While this is going on, here's the Marine advance in northern Okinawa. Basically over 2 weeks, the Marines secure northern Okinawa. There's some fighting in the Motobu Peninsula there, where you see kind of in the center of the map, which is the kind of the nut of Japanese resistance. But by and large, the Marines secure this with very little loss. And by the end of April 1945, are ready for new assignments. So it's a fairly quick victory. Buckner's decision to hit out obviously is rewarded. So let's go to the next. Meanwhile, 24th Corps is not having quite as much fun. They're not having quite as good a progress. They run up against Ushijima's outpost line. Now, this is southern Okinawa. In the bottom left corner is Naha. That's the city of Naha, the Okinawan capital. Just to the east of Naha, you see that red circle? That's the hard nut of the defenses, the Japanese defenses. Shuri, the old ancient Shuri castle, and the Shuri Heights. Directly above that, you see the red lines. That's the outpost position. And the dark blue hatches is 72 hours worth of progress that the Americans make from April 9th to April 12th. And as the 24th Corps commander will later say, it's really difficult. We're going to have to blast them out yard by yard. And so it's going to be slow and it's going to be expensive, which is exactly what Ushijima is planning on. While this is going on, 16th of April, the 77th Division, which had secured Karama-Redo, lands on Aichi and secures this as an airfield and also as a radar station. And secured in about 4 days. 4 days worth of fighting. The big reason that this battle is of noteworthy is because of the next slide. Because accompanying them is the war correspondent Ernie Pyle, who on the 18th of April gets killed by a Japanese machine gun. And this is the monument that they raise, the 77th Division raises to the great chronicler of the World War II GI. And if you read his accounts that he'd published, he went ashore with the Marines on April 1st. It was his first time in the Pacific. He'd spent all his career in Europe. And you could tell he was fascinated by the war in the Pacific and the people that he encountered. And the tribute that the 77th Division puts on this, to me, speaks for the entire Army. Today, the 77th Division, quote, lost a buddy, unquote, Ernie Pyle. And that's on Aishima to this day. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so you can see the progress that's made by late April. We had started north. If you look at the dotted lines or where we start about April 12th, And then in a series of bludgeoning attacks, 24th Corps pushes down to where you see the hatched lines a little bit further south, and then the red splotches that show Japanese resistance. However, by the end of April, the two divisions that are fighting, the 7th and the 96th divisions, are exhausted. In one platoon alone, 44 men had come ashore on the first day, on April 1st. By April 30th, only 11 had not been killed or wounded. And that's a representative platoon, and you multiply that over all the divisions. So they're making progress, but at great cost. And so it's going to prompt a decision. It's going to prompt a transition of the battle here in just a minute or two. How are they doing it? Let's talk about how the Americans are making this progress through these Japanese outposts, through these Japanese defenses. They come up with tactics what Buckner calls blowtorch and corkscrew. And these are the ways to get at Japanese caves. Corkscrew, as you can imagine, and this is actually a good photograph of a corkscrew in action, is using explosives to seal off the Japanese defenders in the cave, at which point they're either going to suffocate or starve. Blowtorch is very similar, except what you do is you pour gasoline, sometimes as much as pumping it down in there. You pour gasoline in there, or white phosphorus, sometimes both, and then you throw a grenade or a satchel charge into the cave and literally burn everybody out. Both of these tactics are documented or are depicted in the movie Hacksaw Ridge. And I talked about how the 24th Corps General Hodge said we have to blast them out yard by yard. That is exactly what it's taking. And you can see it right here. And also notice what is happening to the foliage. There's not a lot of foliage on this battlefield all of a sudden. In fact, veterans of World War I later said, this looked just like Flanders. This looked just like the Western Front. And it's very, very much the same. The heaviest bombardment of the Pacific War, which included offshore gunfire, included air support, included artillery from all available artillery tubes, actually occurs April 19th during some of these attacks. And so it is, the firepower is incredible. And the Okinawan civilians later nicknamed this battle the Typhoon of Steel, which I modify a little bit to say Steel Storm. But that's where it comes from, is the Typhoon of Steel, because of the absolute, just incredible firepower in a concentrated area, not just on the American side. The Japanese meet it, of course, as well, as you can imagine. I talked about Hacksaw Ridge. If you've seen the movie, you know the story. For those of you who don't know the story, this is Desmond Doss, who is standing atop what's known as the Maeda Escarpment, which is in the center of the island, and the photograph requires no additional description. Over the course of a week, 9 times the American troops of the 77th Infantry Division go up that ridge. 8 times they are thrown back by Japanese counterattacks. The 9th time they managed to get up there to stay. Desmond Doss was a conscientious objector. He went through the entire war without carrying a weapon. This was his 3rd invasion, by the way. He had done Guam, he'd done Leyte, and now he'd done here. And he earned the Medal of Honor for saving wounded men and getting them off that ridge, even when the Japanese, even sometimes going behind Japanese lines. And the movie Hacksaw Ridge describes it, depicts it very, very well. And that is Desmond Doss standing atop Hacksaw Ridge after the battle lines had moved on a little bit further. And you can see the ladders and what it, just getting up there, to say nothing of the Japanese shooting at you and defending and defending. It's just, it highlights the ferocity of the battle, and the terrain sometimes was as much an enemy as the Japanese defense. So the battle transitions in late April. Buckner has 3 divisions. He has the 77th, which we've already talked about. He ended up committing. But he also has the Marine divisions that are available for assignment. And there's a lot of discussion about whether or not they should launch an amphibious envelopment on the southeast coast at a place called Minatoga to try and envelop the Japanese and break things loose. The problem with that is Buckner looks at it real hard. He talks to the Navy people. He talks to his staff. And his chief of staff would later say Buckner really wanted to do it. But the problem is two things. Number one, Minnetonka's beaches are not good enough to supply troops over for a long period of time. But number two, as soon as you move inland, you run right into ridges. Come to find out after the battle, Ushijima had deployed an infantry brigade there and was itching for the Americans to try Minnetonka. And Buckner's army is getting tired. And he realizes this could be another Anzio, but worse, is actually what he says. He says to his staff. And if you know anything about the Italian campaign, an American Corps, British American Corps gets stranded south of Rome on a beachhead, too far from the main battlefront to support them. So both sides are too weak to do much of anything, and it's a very difficult situation, this whole presentation in itself. And so Buckner realizes the best thing I can do is to relieve my tired divisions and keep the pressure on here. Plus, he's counting bodies. And he's assuming we're killing 15 of them to every one of our loss. There's only 60 to 70,000 Japanese. They are very close to the end. And if I take Shuri, and if I force a decision at Shuri with these fresh troops, I can win the battle. So that's Buckner's thinking. It's the most controversial part of the battle, but it's worth considering why he made the choice that he did. Ushijima, for his part, his staff is pushing in, let's launch a counteroffensive. They'll launch a counteroffensive in early May. It will fail at the cost of 5,000 well-trained infantrymen and will actually speed up the deterioration of the 32nd Army. At the same time all this is going on, of course, the fleet offshore, more floating chrysanthemum attacks. We should never forget that. And this is what this looks like. During the day, you can see the amount of anti-aircraft fire that is being brought in. In a normal attack, dive bomber turns over and goes into an attack. If a dive bomber gets damaged, they might break off. They're probably going to break off. But a kamikaze attack, you basically have to destroy the plane because by its very nature, the kamikaze attack is not designed to break off. And here's the other thing about a kamikaze attack is for the majority of the American sailors, it affected them psychologically in two major ways. Number one, this was something they were not used to seeing. This was beyond their ken. And I'm speaking very generally, but by and large, it's a common thing. The idea that you die to fight as opposed to fighting to live, which is the American tradition. And so this whole idea that you would willingly go on a one-way mission just is really gets into the Americans' heads. But the other thing is, when you look up at a kamikaze plane diving on you, it doesn't look like it's aimed at anywhere else but you. And so that psychological burden, very quickly, Fifth Fleet realizes that they should wait until the very last minute to issue air raid alerts. Because of the psychological pressure and the normal tension of inbound air attacks, all of this is starting to really frazzle the nerves of the fleet. And it's a real, it's a real issue, something that should be kept in mind. There is combat air patrol, both from shipboard, but also from the Tactical Air Force on Okinawa that help defend. But at the end of the day, as far as the fleet offshore is concerned, anti-aircraft is the last and sometimes the only line of defense. You can see the impact. That's USS Bunker Hill in the lower left corner, on fire after a kamikaze attack. They almost killed Admiral Mark Misher, who commanded Task Force 58, his second flagship in 2 days he'd had to escape from. And by the way, the British are here. We should never forget that. The British Pacific Fleet is here, and that's HMS Formidable, after being struck by a kamikaze. The difference is the British have armored flight decks. So the kamikaze strikes, the British quite literally sweep the remains off into the sea. She looks like she's out of action, right? Within 30 minutes of that photograph being taken, she's back in flight operations. Bunker Hill is out of the war. But after the war, they find out that those ships had suffered very severe structural damage because of the shock of the impact. And so many of them have to be retired prematurely. But in the short run, the British armored flight decks work. Let's go to the next slide, which go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, before we do that, Kathy just passed this on. She had two uncles that were in this battle, and we're talking about the Kamikaze attacks, and
Yep.
they were in the Navy in LSTs. And her uncle Nick said that Kamikaze came from over the island, flew into the LST next to him, killing many servicemen. And he said the stench from the dead was so bad they had to go out to sea for fresh air. So that just reinforces what you were talking about the psychological impact, and whether the Kamikazes obviously damaged a lot of ships. But I think your point being is that along with the physical damage of the ships, the psychological impact of these attacks was something that had to be dealt with.
You're absolutely right. And that whether you're on the sea, in the air, or on the land, there is a visceral impact of the fighting. There's always a visceral impact in war, but Okinawa, because of the ferocity, because of the nature of what was going on in and around the island, it affected people more. And details like that and stories like that you find a lot more often in and around Okinawa than you do necessarily in other places. I appreciate her sharing that. So this is USS Missouri here to the left, and a Kamikaze on April 12th. There is a dent in the hull to this day from what that Kamikaze did. And you can see the gun crews starting to scurry for cover. And then I'm going to, I always show this photograph on the right, and I'm going to give you a few facts about it. I'm going to let you interpret it in the audience as you wish. These are Kamikaze pilots in May, just before they take off. The guy in the right, on the top right, looking off frame, is the only one over the age of 19. The one in the bottom center holding the puppy is 17. He's the youngest documented Kamikaze in the war. And that should tell you how much Japan is straining every sinew for this battle. And I will let you reflect on those facts further as you think about this photograph. Let's go forward, Steve. This is an time exposure at night. And if you read Buckner's diaries, both conventional bombing and kamikazes at night were a real issue. And this is actually taken from one of the air bases, which are quickly developed by the American Air Force. Marines and Army fighters fly off them. And this is anti-aircraft and a time exposure going across. It gives you an idea of the intensity. Even at night, it's a 24-hour battle that's going on above and around the island. So early May, having defeated Uchijima's offensive, on May 11th, Buckner launches his own offensive to try and drive and secure Shuri. And the dotted lines are where they start, and it will develop with offensives in the west by the Marines against Sugarloaf Hill and the Wana Draw, in the center of the 77th Division against Shuri itself, and then on the right, and I'll show you some photographs of the terrain, and we'll talk more about them here in a minute. On the right, the 96th and the 7th Division against Chocolate Drop and Conical Hill. And the whole idea is to push past Shuri and try and crush the Japanese in a pincer movement. And you can see there that center Army objective. That's Shuri. Here's Sugarloaf. 5 days worth of fighting. The Japanese were dug in on the reverse slope, so American artillery and mortars really had trouble getting at them. And you can see it takes tank support, and it takes the 6th Marine Division 5 days to secure Sugarloaf and nearby Crescent Hill. But once they do, Naha is right in front of them, and they're getting past the Japanese flank. So this breaks open the Japanese western flank. And it's a huge victory and an important victory. 2 men who earned the Medal of Honor here later have posts that are still active on our Marine camps on Okinawa named for them. So let's go to the next. We're following again right down the line like I just introduced on the maps. Chocolate Drop. One of the things I like about this is you see the flame-throwing tanks. And it's one of the first times we have a complete tank battalion of flamethrowers. They replaced the cannons with, the Japanese hated flamethrowers, both man-carried and on tanks. And they feared them because the Japanese always believed that the soul would not rest until a part of the body was buried. But if you burn up, there's nothing to bury. And you can see several of these tanks have been knocked out, but you can see how many tanks it takes to secure the dug-in positions here at Chocolate Drop. And, you know, some of these places have names because of what they look like either on the ground or on the map. And they have, you know, Sugarloaf, Chocolate Drop. You know, they sound like pretty nice places, right? Well, no, not at all. Not at all. And then we'll go to the next, which is the left flank here. This is basically from the foreground. If you run basically along the left side of the image and then turn inland and secure Conical Hill right up there at the top left center, that's what two intrepid platoons of the 96th Division managed to do on May 13th. Buckner was watching from an observation post, and he later said this was the finest piece of troop leading he had ever seen. And what it does is the Japanese spend 2 days trying to throw the Americans off. They're not able to do so. And at that point, just like Sugarloaf had been anchored the western flank, this anchored the eastern flank. And so by securing Conical, you get around the Japanese flank. And so it's a huge victory for the Americans on the East Coast. And so within about a week, Buckner's plan appears to be working. And the map actually on the next slide illustrates that perfectly. You can see there the blue splotches there to the left, which are the Marines. The blue arrows and the blue splotches there to the right, which is the 7th Division and 96th Division getting around the Japanese flanks. And you can see in the center of the red hatches of what's left of the Shuri position. The 10th Army is about to close the pincers. They have victory in their grasp, but they can't close it. Why? Let's go to the next slide. Rain. It rains an average of 1 inch a day from May 7th to May 31st. And Buckner later said, just at the time we need the mobility, our tanks are stuck in the mud. That's an artillery piece there on the right, 105 millimeter artillery piece. Notice how you can't even see the tires. And then on the left there, both the self-propelled artillery piece and the tractor going in to try and rescue it are both stuck in the mud. So 10th Army, just as it's about to close, literally gets stuck. That enables Ushijima, who, despite recommendations to fight it out to the end on Shuri, decides I'm going to retreat into southern Okinawa, put an outpost line, retreat under the cover of the weather, retreat under cover of darkness, and they manage to evacuate what's left of 32nd Army down into southern Okinawa. And so it's a missed opportunity for 10th Army, not through any fault of their own. You can't control the weather. Shuri falls May 31st. Huge victory for the Americans. As Buckner sums it up very well when he turns to his staff after seeing this and says, we've passed the speculative phase of the campaign, and now we're in for the final kill. That doesn't mean there won't be stiff fighting. And he was right. So let's go forward. This is the last rounds here. In the top center of the map is Shuri. And you can see here southern Okinawa. You can see the old Japanese red ovals down there as the final Japanese position. There's only about 30,000 Japanese left when they fall back to that final position in southern Okinawa. And the Americans will push southward over the first few days in June. And then in about a week's worth of fighting, from June 10th to June 17th, will break that final line, at which point it'll begin a battle basically to eliminate the last pockets of resistance, formal resistance. Now, I want everybody to pay attention I'm trying to think of how to best to describe it. From the southern tip of Okinawa, go up to the large blob of that's the Japanese positions. Directly above that, along the road there, is a town called Itoman. We'll talk about that here in just a second, and the importance of that location here in just a second. But by June 17th, Ushijima's army is very much on its last legs, and the Americans have victory very much within their sights. The morning of June 18th at Itoman, General Buckner goes to an observation post where the 8th Marine Regiment is going into action on Okinawa for the first time. That's him on the right with the regimental commander and several of the regimental staff. And he stands watching this from here. He watches the Marines go into action, attacking across the valley. And he's watching it for about an hour. This photograph is taken during that time. Shortly after this photograph is taken, the Marines, by the way, had said, hey, we can see the 3 stars on your helmet. Can you take them off? Take it off. And so he puts on a plain helmet, which he has here. He's also standing by that coral boulder, easy cover if needed. Shortly after this photograph's taken, Buckner turns and says, things are going so well here, I think I'll go on to another unit. Just as he says that, a Japanese artillery round strikes that coral rock, knocks all of them down. Buckner takes a piece of coral right here. He begins gasping for air, asks if everybody's okay. Everybody else is fine. They're shaken up. They're okay. He's the only one. They take him down the backside of where one of the regimental surgeons begins to work on him. It becomes very clear that the general who's gasping for air this is not good. He reaches up, trying to get assistance to stand. A private, Harry Sarkeesian, grabs his hand and says to him, you're going home, General. You're homeward bound. And he repeats that as Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. gasps his last breaths. This is shortly after midday, June 18th, 1945. Buckner is the senior American killed by enemy fire in World War II and in the entirety of the 20th century. The next time we lose a 3-star general to enemy action is 9/11. He's buried on Okinawa in a 7th Division cemetery, which had fought in the Aleutians in Alaska. And then in 1949, the family brings him home and he lays in the family plot to this day in Frankfort, Kentucky. Oh, near Daniel Boone's grave, as a matter of fact. Roy Geiger of the 3rd Amphibious Corps takes command temporarily of 10th Army. He is the only Marine and the only aviator of any service to ever command an American field army in battle. He only has that distinction for 5 days when General Joseph Stilwell takes over and will finish out the battle and ultimately command 10th Army until its dissolution later on in the year. So let's go on to the next slide. This is the flag raising, the declaration of Okinawa being secured June 23rd, although mop-up operations and formal resistance will not end until July 2nd. But this is actually the ceremony raising the flag over Okinawa that Geiger presides over on June 23rd, 1945. And so the battle ends. It has been a very bloody affair. The waters, the air, the land of Okinawa has run red with blood. 49,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, including General Buckner, killed, wounded, and missing. If you count the psychological casualties, that number is 75,000, which is the same number as the Battle of the Bulge. 36 Allied ships sunk, another 368 damaged, as you can see there. The Japanese lose over 110,000 killed. 7,000 prisoners, however, more than the rest of the Pacific War put together. Make of that what you will. And then 82,000 of the 400,000 Okinawan civilians die. Many of them are caught in the fighting. Some of them jump, just like the Saipan suicides in 1944, will jump off the cliffs or will kill themselves rather than be given up by the Americans, or be given up to the Americans, just give themselves up to the Americans. And so that adds a whole aspect. This is one of the few battles where the Americans and the Japanese are fighting in islands that are heavily populated by civilians. They had been fought on populated islands before, the Marianas, Philippines, places like that. But in terms of a density of civilian population, this is one of this, and probably Manila and Luzon in the Philippines are the two biggest islands, and the civilians obviously pay a heavy price, for sure. Talk a little bit about legacy. The day General Buckner is killed is the day that Harry Truman, who's the new president, Franklin Roosevelt having died April 12th, has a meeting with his commanders, his senior leaders, about the invasion of the Japanese home islands. And one of the things that they are looking at is they're using the casualty rates on Okinawa to estimate what an invasion might cost. And there's a tremendous book by George Pfeiffer called Tanosin that explores this in great depth, is Okinawa and its influence on the decision to drop the atomic bombs. And of course, the surrender of Japan, August 15th, 1945, which was what that results. There are a lot of people, there are a lot of Okinawa veterans who said that that saved their lives. They were convinced they had fought all this way across the Pacific only to die on the home islands. And this gave them a reprieve. The United States, partly on Buckner's recommendation, Okinawa is such a good base that they actually ruled the Ryukyus until 1972 and then handed back to the Japanese with basing rights. In fact, one of the commanders in Vietnam, Ulysses S. Grant Sharp, later said, we couldn't have fought the Vietnam War without Okinawa. And if you think about Okinawa's influence as an air base for the Far East Air Force during Korea, it played its role as well, which is the next point, as you can see. It's a major Pacific outpost. Even to this day, we've alluded to that a little bit too. Still bears the scars of battles. There was actually a really good Associated Press article yesterday about what the relics that they still find, the tunnels that they're still exploring, the skeletons that they still find. You don't have to scratch very far in Okinawa, and you find remnants of 1945. And the last thing I'll mention from legacy as well is that this battle is being studied by the modern military as a potential example of what a potential battle for Taiwan might be. So it's a whole presentation in itself, but this is still very relevant. Let me give you a couple of final thoughts here, and then we'll open it to questions. Lemuel Shepard, who commanded 6th Marine Division. Okinawa was in many ways the most difficult of the Pacific War, conceived, launched, and supported at long range. It required meticulous detail in both planning and execution. Bad weather, defenses which employed the rugged terrain with great skill and cunning, and a well-trained, resolute defense force combined to give the enemy an advantage that was overcome only by courage, ingenuity, and endurance of the highest order. It is a vital chapter in the history of our nation. And Churchill, who's always quotable, the strength of willpower, devotion, and technical resources applied by the United States places this battle among the most intense and famous of military history. He's absolutely right. They're both right. I think I've got some recommended reading, don't I? Yep.
You do. Yeah.
There's General Buckner and General Shepard actually standing there with General Shepard's the one holding that stick.
Ah, okay.
The official histories by both the Army and the Marine Corps are fantastic. Marine Corps, because marine aviation was so prominent, has a really good section on the tactical Air Force operations as well. So I highly recommend those. You can get them online, actually, at the hyperwar.org. There's also some after-action reports of kamikazes and the offshore operations. So anybody looking to explore aviation aspects of the Okinawa campaign, highly recommend. 10th Army Commander is my book on Buckner, publication of his letters and diaries, first full publication. Tanosin I've talked about, and then a great popular history is that one right there, Typhoon of Steel. So recommend all of them. And so with that, thank you very much, Steve.
Yeah.
I will throw it back to you. I'm sure we've got more questions.
We've got a couple.
To you.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we'll go back to your comment about Chester Nimitz earlier on. And Scott was asking, he said, has there been a Warbird tube on Chester Nimitz, or could you do one? So we'll pencil you in for that.
I wouldn't have offered if I didn't want you to take me up on it, Steve. Absolutely.
But going back to General Buckner, and I saw on some of the maps there that actually it's renamed Buckner Bay.
Yes.
To the east of Okinawa. Why is he not spoken of in the same in the same breath as Nimitz or Patton or any of the other kind of famous generals or admirals leaders in World War II? I mean, what happened on Okinawa and his work in Alaska before that really is very noteworthy, but yet kind of a side note in history.
That's absolutely right. And honestly, the short answer is he gets killed. He was planning to write a memoir, and his death eliminated important parts of 2 chapters of the Pacific War, Alaska and Okinawa. Most Okinawa histories have been written kind of around Buckner, whereas you think about the other World War II campaign histories that you read about, they're into the commanders' heads. because they either have contemporary writings, oral histories, or they have, like in Patton's case, the book War as I Knew It is a tremendous first-person resource on him. Of course, his diaries as well, to cite one example. You don't have that with Buckner. What we have is what's in 10th Army Commander now, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to do it, was to get that out there and make it more widely available. The other thing as well is, in the popular mind, the Pacific War is Pearl Harbor, maybe Midway, maybe Guadalcanal, the atomic bombs, and Iwo Jima. The Army, John McManus, my friend and colleague John McManus, talks about how the Army is largely forgotten in all of this. And that's true, and when you think of the Army, you think of one name in the Pacific. When you think of the Army in the Pacific, one name shows up, Douglas MacArthur. Mm-hmm. And so you put those facts together, and it casts a shadow that it's very difficult to pull the other players in the Pacific out from under. And in Buckner's case, he's handicapped by the fact that he never got to write the memoir that he wanted to write.
Right.
Because he didn't survive.
Well, in reading your book, it's interesting, we talked about this before we came on the air, is that some of his entries are very short. Mm-hmm. Some of them are very verbose, depending on what had happened that day. I mean, there's descriptions of going to dinner with different generals and visiting places. And then there's others that are just, today was Wednesday. And it was fascinating to read and just try to put yourself in the mindset of what was going on in his world while he was chronicling his journeys.
That's one of the things I like about the primary sources is that you get a chance to see these people as people.
Yeah.
We look back on them, they're black and white photographs, but you get a sense of him as a person. And sometimes what he doesn't say is just as important as what he says. There's a great thing that I found in the diary where Nimitz visits Okinawa at the end of April and gives Buckner a bottle of whiskey. And Buckner says, I'll drink this when Okinawa is, secured. 2 weeks later, he's writing to his wife saying, I'm getting thirsty. Little things like that, just little lines say so much. It gives you an insight into a personality as much as you can over the space of 80 years from the written word. But it humanizes these figures, and that's something we shouldn't forget, is from the lowest private to the highest ranking general. At the end of the day, they're all people, and they're all people trying to do their best, just like you and I.
One of the things that also struck me in the book is reading about the fact that the generals in the Pacific, and I'm sure it was the same thing in Europe as well, they traded books back and forth for reading material, and a lot of it was books about the Civil War and combat actions during that war, which I found interesting.
Very much. Well, you think about like Lee's Lieutenants, Douglas Southwell Friedman, those books are coming out during World War II. There's a few others that had come out just before the war. Of course, people are interested. Buckner's dad had served in the Civil War, right. So there's that connection. But the other thing, too, is it's kind of like our generation. When we look back at what was the last really big war that kind of changed everything, that kind of took American warfare and American military history to a new level, both from a popular but also as a military institution. For us, it's World War II. For them, it was the Civil War. And so you put all that together and it makes perfect sense. And if you look at some of the others, particularly in Europe, you'll see where they reference the Civil War. Patton references it quite a bit. There's others that do. Lucius Clay, who's the military governor of Germany after the war, talks about, I grew up in Marietta, Georgia. I was born after the war, but my dad fought in it.
Yeah.
I saw what happened and the aftermath, and that influenced how I treated occupied Germany. So for them, this is a very recent living memory. Civil War veterans, the last Civil War veteran didn't die until 1956.
Yeah.
So Civil War veterans are still very much with them. And so, yeah, it's interesting when you start to look at how much that plays in. It's something we kind of forget about, but for them was very real.
Yeah. Couple of comments here. Sean is saying thank you for a great presentation. His grandfather was part of the 3rd Amphibious Marine Division during the invasion and looks forward to learning more. And William and 2 friends are planning a Pacific Battles tour either in 26 or 27. Okinawa is now on his list of places to go, and he really appreciated the opportunity to tune in tonight as well. So thank you, William and Sean, for those comments. Yeah, and one of the points that you hit on early was the fact that this was in inter-service the operation. I mean, Marines and the Army working together. You would think that there would have been, oh, we're the Marines, we're the Army, but it was not that way in Okinawa. And I attribute most of that, I think, to Buckner's leadership.
It's not just you and I attributing that. One of the Marine official historians of the campaign said exactly the same thing.
Wow.
Buckner and Geiger had met in the 1920s at the Command and General Staff College. Buckner had actually learned to fly before World War I, but didn't have good enough eyes to go into the air service. But they bonded over that and the love of the outdoors. And they always kept in touch. And so when Geiger is assigned to 10th Army, they're old friends.
Yeah.
And that makes a huge difference because that personal relationship, it sets a tone for everybody else. We talk about how organizations, it starts at the top. In so many things, it starts at the top of an organization. That's true here, where Buckner goes out of his way to make sure there's a Army-Marine integration in 10th Army headquarters, but that his relationship with Geiger is frank and is there's no rivalry. We're going to help you, you help us, and you see it a lot during the campaign where units of one service will support the other. The commander of the Tactical Air Force is a Marine general, is a Marine Air General. And Buckner, there's no issue. We're here to do a job. You happen to wear, Eagle, Globe, and Anchor. I happen to wear U.S. Army. We're still here to do a job. Let's not let that get in the way. That sets the right tone, and it makes a huge difference. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It had not always been that way in the Pacific.
Right.
It sure was that way on Okinawa.
Yeah. Alec has a comment as well. He said, excellent presentation. My dad served on the HMS Illustrious with Task Force 57 off Okinawa. He was a batsman. What was a batsman? Isn't
that an officer's aide?
Is it? Okay.
Yeah.
I was thinking cricket, but I realized that's not it.
I'd have to look. I'm a little rusty on my Royal Navy ratings. My grandmother, who was a telephone operator in the Admiralty during the wars, would hate me for saying that. But I'm a little rusty on my Royal Navy ratings. But yeah, Task Force 57, people don't realize it's out there. But the British, full credit to the British and what they do to support the Pacific Fleet. It really, they play a key role.
Absolutely. And that is something that is sometimes lost in today's society, especially, is that there was an allied force. Yes, the United States played a huge role in both the European theater and the Pacific theater, but there was support from a plethora of other allied countries who sent what they could and sacrificed just as much to help secure success. And I'm glad you brought that up, is that it's not just an American thing. It was an allied effort.
Absolutely. And to that end, Bomber Command was starting to deploy to the Pacific when the atomic bombs were dropped, and they were supposed to fly off Okinawa along with 8th Air Force.
Wow. By the way, Leah Block, who's in the background taking care of things, has just done some research. A batsman for the Royal Navy would have been controlling the takeoffs and landings on aircraft carriers.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and by the way, the Illustrious was hit by a kamikaze and returned to Australia. So
okay, yeah.
Thank you, Alec, for your comment. Dominic is also, my father served in the 6th Marine Division, was among those who took Sugarloaf Hill, and he said this presentation means a lot to me. So,
thank you very much.
Yeah,
salute to him. That was a tough nut to crack.
Yeah. Before we sign off tonight, you've got the book. I've got the book. I read the book. I love it.
Thank you.
If you need a copy of it, where can people get it?
You can get it on Amazon. You can get it as ebooks. You can also get it directly from our publisher, which is Casemate. It's wherever you get your books, and it's also available in big bookstores around the country.
Very good. What's next for you?
I don't know. My book topics usually find me. This one found me and said you have to write it. The next book topic is still searching for me, and I'm still searching for it. But believe me, I'll let you know. I'll let you know when I find it.
Sounds good. And if folks want to visit the museum, either virtually or in person, what's the best way to find out more about the Wisconsin Veterans Museum?
Wisconsin Veterans Museum is in downtown Madison, Wisconsin. We're free. We're open to the public 6 days a week. You can find us wizvetsmuseum.com, WISVETS museum.com. You can also Google Wisconsin Veterans Museum. We've got a lot of great online content. Our catalog is online, searchable of oral histories, of information, of artifacts, all kinds of stuff. So feel free to check us out.
Sounds good. All right. Well, thank you, Chris. And we know what our next topic will be. That'll be Nimitz and leadership, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. We'll get that one on the schedule. And we want to thank you all for joining us tonight and for your comments and questions. We appreciate it. It makes this fun to do. So if you'd would do us a favor, if you like what you saw tonight, please share it across your social media platforms. We do appreciate it. And if you have ideas like the one about maybe we should do something on Nimitz and leadership, just drop us an email. media@cafhq.org. And also, if you have any comments, if you'd like to see us do more of something or less of something, whatever it is, we just enjoy hearing from you, our loyal audience. Remember, if you are watching on YouTube, click that subscribe button and also the bell icon to get notifications when our new episodes are posted. Until next time, thanks again for joining us tonight. Thank you, Chris, for being a part of this. It's a wonderful topic, great show. And until next time, wishing you blue skies and tailwinds. Have a great night.